Indiana won. Let's be completely clear about that up front. The final buzzer sounded, the scoreboard favored the Fever, and Caitlin Clark hit a shot that will live in highlight reels for a long time. But if you walked away from that game thinking everything is fine in Indianapolis, then you either didn't watch closely enough or you're choosing not to see what was plainly visible for 40 minutes. Because what happened in that building against the Washington Mystics was not a feel-good story about a team clicking at the right moment. It was a story about one player being brilliant enough, tough enough, and frankly extraordinary enough to rescue an organization from its own decisions, again. And the fact that it keeps happening, game after game, in this exact same pattern means we can no longer call it a fluke, a bad night, or a coincidence. This is the Indiana Fever season in a single game. Two completely contradictory things, both undeniably real, both demanding to be talked about with the kind of honesty that this situation has earned. The first thing is the shot. Deep range, off the dribble, defender right in her face, game hanging on every inch of that arc. That is not a shot that most professional basketball players can produce in the most pressurized moment of a competitive game. The list of competitors in the history of this sport who can manufacture that kind of clutch output after everything that surrounded it in that specific game is extremely short. Clark is on that list. She proved it again. The second thing is everything that happened before the shot made it necessary. And here's what needs to be understood before we go any further. The shot being incredible does not cancel out the chaos. The shot being real does not make the 17-point lead that nearly vanished unreal. These things coexist. They always have in this season. And anyone doing an honest accounting of this franchise's situation has to examine both with equal weight. Or they're not actually doing an honest accounting. They're just picking the part of the story that makes them comfortable. So, let's start from the beginning, because the first quarter of this game is the foundation that makes everything else analytically explosive. Caitlin came out against Washington and was not just playing well, she was rolling. There is a meaningful difference between those two things, and it matters enormously in this context. Rolling means rhythm. Rolling means the kind of individual offensive momentum where every decision feels one step ahead of the defense, where the shot looks right before it leaves the hand, where the playmaking flows naturally into the scoring and back again without friction. She had 10 points early in the opening quarter, and the trajectory of what she was producing in those minutes was not subtle. It was a mathematical projection written in real time on the floor in front of everyone watching. If you sustain that output across 40 minutes, you are looking at a 40-point performance, not a maybe 40-point performance, not a theoretical 40-point performance under ideal conditions, a 40-point game based on what was actually occurring on that basketball court. The team was winning comfortably. The momentum was entirely in Indiana's favor. The defense was holding, and the offense had a pulse that it rarely finds with the consistency this team needs. Everything that Indiana is supposed to be doing was happening, and the central reason it was happening was that Caitlin Clark was being allowed to play basketball in positions where her skills could actually express themselves. Simple concept, obvious results. And then something happened that requires direct, unflinching examination, because what the head coach did next is not a decision that gets to hide behind good intentions or complicated strategic reasoning. It is a decision with a paper trail across this entire season, and the paper trail is damning. Stephanie White pulled Caitlin Clark from the game for the first 7 minutes of the second quarter. 7 minutes. With Clark on the bench, Indiana still held the lead they had built, but the energy that Clark's play had created evaporated almost immediately. The comfortable advantage Indiana had accumulated over the opening quarter, 17 points, began to compress. Not because Washington suddenly found something they hadn't had before, not because the Mystics made some halftime adjustment that cracked Indiana's defensive scheme, but because the player who had been generating the offensive output that made 17 points possible was sitting on the bench in street clothes while the game continued without her. Here is what makes this particular decision so difficult to rationalize. Clark had 10 early first-quarter points. The team was winning, the momentum was completely in Indiana's direction, and in that exact moment, with the offense producing and the lead growing and the competitive trajectory pointing entirely the right way, the head coach decided that was the correct time to remove her best player from the competition. Not after a cold stretch, not after a turnover sequence, not after Clark had shown any sign of individual fatigue or defensive breakdowns that justified a prolonged absence. At the peak of her production, at the moment when sustaining that momentum would have made the second quarter a formality, White removed her for 7 minutes. And here's the thing that turns this from a one-game observation into something much more serious. This is not new. This is not a coaching adjustment made once that deserves the benefit of the doubt. This is a pattern that has been documented with painful consistency across this entire season, game after game in a sequence so repeatable that calling it a coincidence stopped being intellectually honest months ago. Clark produces, Clark gets hot. Clark gets benched. The lead shrinks or disappears. Clark returns to a deteriorated competitive situation and has to spend the back half of a game digging out of a hole that should never have existed. That cycle has played out so many times this season that it has its own recognizable shape. And this game against the Washington Mystics added another entry to the list. The only reason it did not cost Indiana the game outright is that Clark subsequently produced a game-winning shot that the coaching-induced collapse made necessary in the first place. Think about that sentence carefully, because it is the defining irony of this Indiana Fever season. The shot that saved the game only needed to exist because of decisions made by the coaching staff that nearly lost it. The missed challenge on the foul call is a separate issue from the bench management, but it belongs in the same conversation because it reflects the same underlying pattern of coaching choices that left Clark without the organizational support her competitive situation demanded. During the contest, a foul was assessed against Clark in a situation where multiple observers watching the play noted that contact did not occur. The kind of call that happens in basketball sometimes, that officials get wrong in real time and that the challenge system was specifically designed to address. The challenge mechanism exists as a tool for coaching staffs to contest officiating decisions that the evidence suggests were incorrect. It is a resource. It is a protection. It is one of the few direct interventions a head coach can make to protect their players from calls that are not supported by what actually happened. Stephanie White did not use it. The foul stood. The opportunity to restore the competitive equity that the incorrect call had disrupted passed without being exercised. Now, some will argue that coaches make dozens of in-game decisions and that a single unchallenged call is not the kind of thing that defines a coaching performance. That argument would carry more weight if it existed in isolation. But it does not exist in isolation. It exists alongside the 7-minute bench stint. It exists alongside the offensive system that has produced consistently lower scoring outputs than the roster's talent should generate. It exists alongside the fourth-quarter possession decisions we will get to shortly. Each individual choice might be defensible on its own in a vacuum. Taken together as a pattern across this specific game and across this entire season, they tell a coherent story about a coaching environment that is consistently failing to maximize what it has available. Challenging an incorrect call communicates something important beyond the tactical outcome of whether the call gets overturned. It tells the officials that the bench is watching closely and will contest decisions that the evidence does not support. It tells the players on the floor that the people in the huddle are invested in protecting them from calls that are wrong. When that communication does not happen in a moment when it clearly should have, something is lost that does not get recovered by the final whistle, regardless of what the scoreboard says. Now, here is the part of this story that has been generating the most conversation in the days since the game, and for legitimate reason, because it cuts to something deeper than any single tactical decision. The game-winning play that Clark hit to seal Indiana's victory did not come from a play designed by the head coach. Based on accounts from observers who were able to see into the timeout huddle during the sequence that preceded the final possession, it was assistant coach Austin Kelly who drew up the play, not Stephanie White. Austin Kelly.
And the play that Kelly designed put the ball in Clark's hands in exactly the position from which her capabilities could deliver the decisive moment. Simple, direct, built around the best player's strengths, executed to perfection. Let that sit for a moment before moving on, because the analytical implications of that single fact are significant. The assistant coach drew up a play that put the ball in Clark's hands in a decisive moment. The play worked. The game was won, and the offensive system that the head coach has designed and operated throughout this entire season has not consistently produced those conditions across 40 minutes of competitive basketball. The assistant drew up the right play. The head coach's season-long system has not consistently drawn up the right plays. That is not a narrative. That is not an interpretation. That is a direct comparison between two observable data points that exist in the same game, produced by people in the same organization. And they tell completely different stories about what happens when offensive design prioritizes putting Caitlin Clark in positions where her skills can operate freely.
The conversation this detail invites is uncomfortable for everyone involved, which is probably why some analysts have chosen to gloss over it. But the discomfort does not reduce its significance. If the best offensive design for this team's best player came from the assistant in the most important possession of the game, the questions that raises about the head coach's season-long system design are not unfair questions. They are the obvious questions, and they deserve direct answers rather than being softened into something more palatable. The offensive production numbers from this game are not a footnote. They are a central piece of evidence in an ongoing case about what this coaching staff's system is actually producing. Indiana scored 78 points against the Washington Mystics. 78. Take a moment to contextualize that number against what this team is supposed to be capable of. Not long ago, games this season and throughout the previous season featured Indiana scoring 100 points with a regularity that made the offense genuinely difficult to defend against. The team had a scoring identity. The team had an offensive engine. Opponents had to account for the threat that Indiana could put points on the board in sustained, efficient waves, and that threat shaped how defenses were constructed against them. That offense has been replaced by something that scores 78 points against the Washington Mystics and requires a last-second game winner to avoid an outright loss to a team that represents one of the lower competitive benchmarks in the league. This is not a random fluctuation. This is not a cold shooting night that statistical variance can explain away. The connection between the offensive decline and the system design decisions this coaching staff has consistently made is direct and observable. You do not go from 100-point offense to 78-point performance against Washington through player regression alone. You get there through the installation of an offensive philosophy that does not maximize the capabilities of the best offensive player on the roster, applied consistently enough over a full season that the results compound into the numbers we are now watching in real time. Clark finished with 19 points on 7 of 16 from the field and 4 of 10 from three-point range with 5 assists. Those are real numbers. Those are solid professional basketball numbers. They are absolutely not the numbers of a player who was on pace for 40 points, who was allowed to remain on the floor and continue doing what she was doing in the first quarter. They are the numbers of a player who was interrupted at the peak of her individual offensive momentum, had her rhythm disrupted by a 7-minute bench absence at the worst possible time, and then had to rebuild from a compromised position against a defense that had been given time to reset and recalibrate. The gap between 19 points and 40 points is not talent, it is circumstance, and the circumstances were manufactured by coaching decisions. The individual performance breakdowns from other contributors matter here because the near collapse of that 17-point lead did not come from a single source. It came from the accumulation of execution failures across multiple players in situations where production was required, and examining each one honestly is part of the complete picture. Kelsey Mitchell finished with 15 points on 6 of 14 from the field and 1 of 6 from three-point range. The 1 of 6 from three-point range number is the one that demands attention. That is not a shooting slump in a single game. That reflects the ongoing perimeter efficiency challenges that have characterized Mitchell's shooting throughout the season, and it represents a real problem for an offense that needs reliable three-point production to function at the level this roster is capable of. 3 assists is a marginal improvement in her playmaking, but it does not address the core observation that has been made repeatedly about her tendency to stop offensive flow rather than advance it. Aliyah Boston had 14 points and 10 rebounds. That double-double represents genuine interior presence and reflects the kind of consistent production that Boston has delivered throughout her time in Indiana. But the fourth-quarter layup misses that observers noted are a specific and pointed concern for a player whose contract demands reliable close-range conversion. These are not contested jump shots in traffic. These are the kinds of high-percentage looks close to the basket that interior players at Boston's level and compensation are expected to convert without drama. When those misses happen in the fourth quarter of a close game, they are not neutral events. They are direct contributors to the competitive collapse that made a game winner necessary. If Boston converts those opportunities, the game is over before Clark needs to produce the kind of contested deep-range shot she hit. Those missed layups are part of the chain of events that put the game in jeopardy. Lexie Hull played 22 minutes and produced 8 points on 3 of 3 from the field and 2 of 2 from three-point range. Read those efficiency numbers again slowly. 3 of 3 from the floor, 2 of 2 from 3. Perfect field goal efficiency across every shot attempt she took. Combined with strong defensive effort on her primary matchup throughout the time she was on the floor, Hull's 22-minute performance in this game makes the argument for her receiving substantially more floor time by itself. The case being made by those who track Hull's impact closely that she should be receiving 30 or more minutes per game is grounded in exactly this kind of performance: a player shooting 100% from the field, playing strong defense, contributing efficiently in every area she touched, who was only on the floor for 22 minutes in a game that nearly collapsed and was ultimately decided by a single shot. The minutes allocation does not match the production evidence. That gap is a coaching decision, and the result of that decision is a player whose impact could have significantly stabilized the competitive situation, spending 8 minutes watching from the bench while the lead evaporated. Sophie Cunningham's role in this game touches on a tendency that has come up repeatedly in analytical conversations about Indiana's offense this season. The issue is specific. When Clark is in position to receive the ball and initiate offense, Cunningham has shown a pattern of looking her off and attempting to create independently instead. This is not a general criticism of Cunningham's game. Her highest value contribution to this team is defined and clear. Catch the three-point looks that Clark's playmaking creates and shoot them with efficiency and discipline. That function, executed consistently and within its specific boundaries, makes Cunningham a genuinely valuable piece of a high-functioning offense. The problem is that departing from that function, choosing to dribble into offensive creation situations where Clark is available as the primary ball handler, removes something from the offense that Cunningham's individual ball handling cannot replace. Clark's facilitation creates advantages. Those advantages turn into open looks for shooters around her. When those shooters are disciplined enough to stay in their lanes and take the shots that the playmaking creates for them, the offense functions efficiently. When they look off the ball handler and try to manufacture something independently, the advantage disappears, the play slows, the defense recovers, and the offense that should have produced a clean look instead produces a contested pull-up or a turnover, or a possession that ends with nothing. Cunningham's best basketball exists in the structure that Clark's playmaking creates around her. When she steps outside that structure, she is not playing better, she is just playing differently. And the difference costs the team in ways that the cumulative box score numbers often obscure. The fourth quarter Ty Harris situation deserves to be called exactly what it was, because softening the language around it does a disservice to the analytical reality of what the coaching staff chose to do.
With the game in its most critical stretch, with Indiana's 17-point lead having compressed to the point where every possession carried outsized weight, the coaching staff ran 2 consecutive plays designed around Harris, 2 consecutive fourth-quarter possessions in a close game directed away from Clark and toward Harris. That is a coaching decision. It was made deliberately, and it needs to be examined against the competitive context in which it was made. The Washington Mystics are not a defensive juggernaut. They are not a team whose personnel or scheme creates particularly complex problems for Indiana's offensive decision-making. The situation in that fourth quarter was not one where running away from your best player and toward a less proven offensive option was supported by anything in the competitive environment. It was not supported by Clark being in foul trouble. It was not supported by Harris having produced a performance that warranted that level of fourth-quarter offensive investment. 2 consecutive possessions, away from Clark, toward Harris, in the fourth quarter of a game that was being contested against one of the lower competitive benchmarks in the league. That sequence is a coaching decision that the statistical record of this season and the competitive circumstances of that specific game do not justify, and it was directly part of why the game remained close enough to require a game winner in the final seconds. The near collapse of that 17-point lead is the coaching story of this game, not the game winner, not Clark's competitive resilience, the coaching story. And the reason that distinction matters is that the game winner has a way of making people comfortable with what preceded it, of washing over the chain of decisions that created the conditions requiring it, of turning a coaching failure into a feel-good narrative simply because the talent on the floor was exceptional enough to overcome it. Indiana does not nearly blow a 17-point lead to the Washington Mystics through player failures. The talent gap between these two teams does not produce that kind of near collapse through normal competitive variance. You nearly blow a 17-point lead to Washington through mismanaged bench rotations, misdirected offensive possessions in the critical fourth quarter stretch, a failure to protect your best player from a questionable call through the mechanisms specifically designed for that purpose, and 7 minutes of removing that player at the precise moment she was generating the kind of individual momentum that the game plan should have been built to sustain and amplify.
Those are coaching-produced outcomes, each one, individually and collectively. The game-winning shot that Clark hit is extraordinary. It is genuinely extraordinary. Missed 2 consecutive free throws, then hit a deep, contested game winner in the same sequence 30 seconds later. That is not normal. That is not the kind of response that even experienced professional players consistently produce in that situation. It is the specific and rare competitive character that separates players who perform at Clark's level from players who merely play the same sport at a professional level. But that extraordinary shot does not retroactively justify the decisions that made it necessary. It does not transform the 7-minute bench stint into good coaching. It does not turn the unchallenged foul call into a defensible decision. It does not make the 78-point offensive output represent a well-functioning offensive system. The shot is one data point. Everything around it is a separate data point, and the complete analytical record of this game contains all of them. Here is where this entire season has been pointing, and this game against Washington crystallized it with more clarity than any single contest has managed before it. The Indiana Fever have a player on their roster who can produce game-winning shots in the most pressurized moments available in professional basketball. A player who can score 40 points in a game when she is allowed to remain on the floor at the peak of her momentum. A player whose playmaking creates advantages for everyone around her, whose competitive character produces extraordinary results in extraordinary circumstances, and whose ceiling as an individual performer is high enough that conversations about her place in the history of the sport are not hyperbole. They are legitimate analytical assessments based on observable production.
That player is being coached in an environment that consistently interrupts her momentum, misallocates the possessions around her, fails to protect her from officiating decisions through available tools, and designs game-winning plays around her only when the assistant steps in at the last possible moment to get it right. The margin between those two realities, between what Clark produces and what the coaching environment around her consistently provides, has been razor thin in too many games this season. Indiana is on the right side of the final score tonight because Clark delivered a shot that a very small number of players in the history of the sport can produce when everything is on the line. That is not a sustainable model. That is not a franchise strategy. That is one player's extraordinary talent bridging a gap that organizational competence should have closed before the final possession was ever reached. And the question that the Indiana Fever front office needs to be asking itself loudly and urgently is what it would actually look like to build a coaching environment worthy of the player they have been lucky enough to employ. Because the wins are going in the record books. The coaching decisions that keep making those wins dramatically more difficult than they should be are going in the analytical record right alongside them. And one of those records has a fixed end date. The talent holding everything together does not last forever. At some point, the shot does not go in. At some point, the near collapse becomes an actual collapse. At some point, the margin that Clark has been covering with her competitive brilliance runs out completely. When that moment arrives, the coaching decisions being made right now will not look like minor concerns that got papered over by a game winner. They will look like what they actually are: a pattern of organizational mismanagement applied consistently to one of the most valuable players this league has produced. Indiana won tonight. But winning this way, by this much luck and this much individual brilliance in this specific sequence, is not a program building towards something. It is a program surviving in spite of itself. And those are two very different things.